Great. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the National Conference Centre of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm the National Executive Director of the Institute. And it's my pleasure to open the launch of this new book, Peacebuilding in Cambodia, the Role of the Paris Accords. This is the fruit of a project that we have been putting together with Asialink. In fact, Asialink's been leading it, truth be told. And it started with an online event that we held last year with a number of Australian and international observers. Tonight we have mostly Australians, and we're joined by her first at her first event here at the AIIA National Conference Centre by Martin Letts, who is the new CEO of Asialink, or relatively new CEO of Asialink. Before we get started, however, I would like, as is customary, to acknowledge that we are here in Canberra on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So without further ado, I would now like to pass things over to Martine. Come and join me, I guess, on the podium.
Thanks very much, Bryce. Thank you for that warm welcome. And I don't want to stand in the way of what promises to be a really interesting discussion, but just to also acknowledge that this project was supported by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Defence. And the publication you see before you is a summary of the discussion that took place at that forum that was organised in conjunction with those departments. And very much the idea was to really understand 30 years later not only what the impact of the Paris Peace Accords were, but also to understand the circumstances which led to these accords, and what, if anything, this tells us today about how nations and the international community can navigate a new set of geopolitical uncertainties and the impact of the new geopolitical uncertainties on our region. So what we're going to be talking about in various ways through the discussion, initially from the presentations from our panelists and then a panel discussion, is how did it happen? Could it happen today? And do we have the diplomatic infrastructure and muscle and institutions to deliver and the circumstances under which something like this could be delivered again? I'm also conscious of the fact that we've got quite a big group of people zooming in on this. So we're really pleased to have such a large group of participants who are zooming in, who are also going to have an opportunity to ask questions once we've had our initial presentations and our discussions. So roughly each speaker will say 8 minutes of introduction. I'm going to talk about the past, but also talk about current perspectives. And John, for example, has just been recently back to Cambodia. Will have some very interesting things to tell us about also the perspectives of some of his interlocutors 30 years down the track. So we'll hear 8 minutes from opening remarks, and then we will go to a moderated discussion, followed by an opportunity, 15 minutes or so of Q&A from the audience. I'd like to introduce now our first speaker, Michael Costello, who will address you and provide his perspectives, and then we'll move to John Sanderson, and Katrin Trevillon will bring up the rear in her presentation. Thanks, Mike.
Well, thank you, Martine. I go back a long, long way now to 1983, when the Hawke government had just been elected. One of the very first things Hawke did was get the man he replaced as leader just before the election into his office and say, I want you to solve the Cambodia problem. It shouldn't be too hard. You know, I've been a very good trade union leader. I bring people together and we sort out a solution. You should be able to knock this out pretty quickly. So Hayden, knowing how difficult it was, set out, and between 1983 and 1987, did what he could to try and make progress on the Cambodia problem. But he didn't. And at the end, he went to Vietnam and he saw and spoke to Hun Sen, who was then the foreign minister of the Vietnamese installed government. The foreign minister of Thailand, the frontline state, who ASEAN supported, said, you've got to make a choice, Australia. Are you with the communists or are you with us? And he did have to make a choice, and he did, and we ceased and desisted. Gareth Evans became Foreign Minister in 1989, and he succeeded where Hayden had failed. So what was the difference? Was Hayden an idiot and Evans a genius? Well, Evans will probably subscribe to that, but it's not entirely true, although I'll have things to say about Gareth a little later. The problem was that Hayden faced, and that Gareth didn't face, was a different strategic situation, both globally and regionally. Just remember, in 1983 and right through under Reagan, the Americans were still full of bitterness about the whole Indochina experience. They, like we, had been humiliated. Russia was supporting Vietnam because Vietnam and China were loggerheads, and anything that put China off was a good thing from Russia at that time. How different it is now. China was supporting the KR and Sihanouk against Vietnam. And Thailand, as I said, was the frontline state, absolutely and rightly petrified with the presence of Vietnamese forces on its border. And ASEAN was totally committed to supporting Thailand in that case. Come 1988, 1989, Gorbachev had transformed the global geostrategic situation. The Americans were now in pals with them. The Chinese were making up with them. And they told the Vietnamese, guys, we're not going to be able to keep funding you in this war for too much longer. So you had a situation which created an opportunity for someone to take. The French held a conference in Paris in July, August that year. And despite the better environment, it made bits and pieces of progress, but not a lot. And it failed on the central question about who was going to govern Cambodia while any election was being held. And that was where political exigency in Australia drove Gareth and the Prime Minister to send me off in a bit of a forlorn hope to see if we could make any progress. As it happened, we did. We were successful. We were successful because of extreme degree of hard work by Gareth and the department, by a very high level of work over many, many, many years preceding it by embassies and by the Defence Department and many other agencies in establishing our credibility and standing in ASEAN particularly. Gareth had established a very close friendship and relationship of trust with Alatas, the Indonesian Foreign Minister, who was the leader in this. And it's worth remembering something else. Hayden may have failed, but what he did laid the groundwork for what I did. He became close to UNTAC, the powerful Foreign Minister of Vietnam. It was Hayden who was the first Western leader, really, who told the Americans the Russians are changing, Gorbachev is for real. Who went there, saw Gorbachev, met Rogachev, who was their lead person on Vietnam. And that gave me credence with them. Most importantly, he'd take a big risk in meeting Hun Sen. And when Hun Sen found that I'd been working for Hayden, it gave me credibility and trust. So all that work hadn't been wasted. All that work was essential. So I did my shuttle diplomacy. And it was a grinding, hard, detailed work that John can testify. There was no quick, 3-page document. It had to be convincing in all its aspects, and the department did nearly all that work. And the other thing that needs to be absolutely remembered is this. The P5, the permanent members of the Security Council, because of the changed geostrategic situation, were able to work together in a productive way. The question that you've asked me to address is, can this happen today? I think I've answered it, haven't I? The P5 are the loggerheads again. And that's a subject we'll no doubt talk about quite a bit later on. I do not see them in a hurry working together on problems like Myanmar. Why would the Chinese and Russians give America a break on Myanmar or the West a break on Myanmar? They have no real interest in doing that. What worries me is that the two biggest problems that face humanity, I don't say the world, because the world will survive without humanity, are climate change, which we sort of shrug our shoulders about, and it's really about 10th order down the list of what the countries really seem to work on, and nuclear weapons, which we've talked about endlessly, and now in the last few weeks are seriously contemplating their possible use. None of those problems, those humanity-threatening problems, can be resolved without the involvement of those three major countries. Of course, others as well, but without those three, especially China and the US, those problems cannot be dealt with. They make the problem of Cambodia look like kid stuff. What surprises me is how unalarmed the Australian people are at the nuclear threat, because it is real. So that's the answer to your question. Is there a role for Australia? Of course there is. You know, I've never thought of foreign policy as creating a stable, static set of rules that everybody accepts they won't change. We thought they'd been created. We called it the end of history. That's what we thought. I do remember the only politician at the time who gave a speech saying this is nonsense was Bill Hayden. Everybody else accepted it, a sense of hubris about what we'd achieved, winning the Cold War. When Putin, as president of Russia, went to NATO Secretary General and said, we want to join NATO, he was told you'll have to stand in a queue and fill in the forms. Hubris. We thought our rules were the rules for everybody. But they don't take that view. They don't take that view. People are extremely tribal. They're tribal about nations within nations. They're tribal about religion. They're tribal about gender. They're tribal about any number of things, but most of all, they're tribal about history. History drives so many of these people. What is Putin on about? History. What is MAGA? It's about history. We were great once. What is Britain about and Brexit about? It's about the Second World War and our glorious days. That's what it's about. You cannot simply say, we've got this huge set of rules. Now line up everybody. We have to find a way in our foreign policy, is the way I see it, that it's not to establish a state of permanent stability, a stasis in which we can all be comfortable forever. We have to find a way of managing in a world that's an ending state of disequilibrium over ever new disputes and crises, many of them arising from history, many of them arising from new challenges. And our most immediate and biggest problem, which we cannot get the key partners to address because of their geostrategic rivalry, I repeat, are the humanity problems of climate change and nuclear. I think my 8 minutes is up.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Well, what a year 1989 was. I must say, the German border came down. The Soviet Union began to collapse in on itself. The Vietnamese withdrew from Cambodia, and I was called up to Canberra and promoted to Major General and told I was going to be Chief of Defence Force Policy and reorganise the defence staff of the higher defence staff and get it done between March and May. I remember it quite vividly. But it was a direct lead into my involvement through my later appointment with Foreign Affairs. And looking from the outside, I could see the absolutely amazing work that was being done in forging an international agreement for Cambodia. And I say forging an international agreement, of course, we weren't the people who were leading in the agreement process, but it was the initiative of Gareth and the department that produced the Red Book that turned the tide in the negotiating process. So the Paris Accords were the documents, the agreements that took me to Cambodia, and I read them day in and day out. They were the things that gave me my legitimacy in Cambodia, hour by hour, day by day, month by month. Without those Paris Accords, we would not have had any legitimacy in Cambodia. We would have been exposed to all sorts of conflict. But when I went into Cambodia, that document was the document that I read in great depth before I went through the reconnaissance and planning process. And every day in New York, I read through the document, and this continued on into Cambodia. When I got into Cambodia, I got all sorts of advice on what the Accords meant from all sorts of people who weren't responsible for the outcomes or the conduct of the operations, including some advice from journalists in accordance with things that they'd heard discussed by senior UN officers in the bar the night before. I often think that is history shaped in this way? And some of those stories, of course, made it onto the wire services and went to New York, influenced the way the people in the United Nations were thinking about this. But one of the consequences of being in command of an operation like that is you're not within any sort of command structure that you have when you're a national commander. You're within a very loose international structure, but you are still responsible for everybody you command, everybody you support, for Cambodians themselves that have committed themselves to the whole process. And that goes on and weighs heavily from day to day about those sort of things. So you're constantly negotiating with people on that basis. Now, when I got into Cambodia, there were some Cambodians who told me that I didn't understand what the Accords were about. He said that because you weren't in the negotiating process, you weren't at the agreements, you don't understand what they were about. And after a period of time, I came to realize that there were actually two agreements operating in Cambodia. One was the one that had been forged by the international community and had been included in the mandate that we got from the Security Council to establish UNTAC. This was essentially a reflection of the United Nations. It was a liberal democratic agreement with the aim of having a free and fair election and the outcomes guaranteeing the rights of the Cambodian people, which required all the people who had actually signed up with this agreement to also sign up for the protocols and conventions that the United Nations had been forging ever since 1945 that defined the rights of nations, and not only the rights of nations, but the rights of individuals within nations. All those conventions, they were included in the mandate. The other agreement, Camilla kept saying to me, you don't understand the agreement, General Sanderson, you weren't there. But the other agreement was an agreement between Sihanouk, who had been the leader of the president of the CGDK, between him and the four parties. Okay, and the message of that agreement was, you get me into the palace, and I'll create a government and I'll embrace you all in the whole process. Okay, so there was a conflict in these two agreements. Now, one was a Liberal Democratic agreement, and one was about taking Cambodia back to where it had been when all this problem started. So we had to work our way through that and stick with the whole process of delivering to the Cambodian people a free and fair election and a basis in human rights and government, which would allow whatever government that emerged out of the constitutional process to actually govern effectively in the future. Okay, the election itself was a great success. I think we can say, I mean, you know, I thought the electoral component registered authentically, 97% of the adult Cambodians, and they were enfranchised by this whole process. The Khmer Rouge insisted that most of them were Vietnamese, therefore they couldn't participate in the process, but it was a very authentic registration. And then by one way or another, we got 90% of those people to the polling places. And at the end of the day, you know, it was astonishing, really, euphoric is the way I would describe it, that actually happened. And that was about the bravery of the Cambodian people and their commitment to this process. We had a letter from Khieu Samphan immediately after the election saying, "You're lying. I have proof that 90% of the people did not vote in various places." I still can't quite fathom why he would say such a thing. But this is as president of the Khmer Rouge. I can only believe that the Khmer Rouge cadre around the countryside were telling the leaders what they wanted to hear.
Stolen election.
Stolen election. So 90% of the Cambodian people voted. A staggering commitment because they were told that they'd walk through blood and fire to get to the polling places, and they did. And you know, all the days of the election were absolutely fantastic. So the UN delivered that, but afterwards, the development of the constitution, the constitutional process, was, I think, warped by the other agreement in Cambodia. It was warped by the other agreement. The constitution that came up with dual prime ministers and dual ministers of state was a certainty to end up in a coup d'etat with the most powerful party in control of Cambodia. And that's exactly what happened. Now, the most powerful party in Cambodia was a puppet government that had been installed by the Vietnamese and the Russians back in 1979. If you think about it, with the Russians and the Vietnamese coming into Cambodia and taking over the country, waiting 14 months before they let the Western press in, it looks a lot like what's going on in the Ukraine today. So the government that was installed there and it commanded you know, most of the country with the support of the Vietnamese forces up until 1989. But after the withdrawal of the Vietnamese, it had to sign up to the agreements in order to get legitimacy with the international community and establish a place within ASEAN and the rest of the world. You all know the Khmer Rouge had the seat in the United Nations for a large part of that time. So the outcome of all of this, which is, as Michael's pointed out, resulted from a confrontation between China and Russia. You know, when Russia and Vietnam invaded Cambodia, the Chinese invaded the north of Vietnam and were fought to a standstill. They said they were going to teach the Vietnamese a lesson, and they were fought to a standstill by the Vietnamese with serious Russian help. That wouldn't happen today, I can tell you. At that stage, the Chinese didn't have a navy, and the vulnerability of the Western Cambodian border, which is the primary strategic concern to Vietnam. They know all about how vulnerable it is because that's how they fought the war in the South. That is now a problem for the future that the Chinese have already solved all of those problems. We would not have had an election in Cambodia if it hadn't been for the Chinese. At the critical moment in early 1993, they withdrew support from the Khmer Rouge, and the United Nations was able to decide to go to the election without the Khmer Rouge participation. And one of the consequences, the outcome of that, is that now China is the protector in Cambodia, and Cambodia is well and truly on the Belt and Road. What choice do they have? It gives them wriggle room between Thailand and Vietnam, and that's the way that Hun Sen runs the country, with that wriggle room. And the message is that he runs a win-win strategy, that he's tried to embrace everybody in this. He was not in agreement with putting the Khmer Rouge on trial. This is a Cambodian problem from his perspective, and he modus operandi was to sort that out within Cambodia, but he was forced to participate in an international act there. So they're well and truly on the Belt and Road. China is the protector. It gives them the wriggle room between Vietnam and Thailand, and that's the world that we live in today.
Good evening. Thank you for the introduction, Martin, and also thank you for the invitation. So with General Sanderson and Michael Costello, we've already heard the perspective of two practitioners. So I thought I'd flag up front that my role is rather different. I'm a peacebuilding scholar and one who has been less occupied, I guess, with grand strategic design or great power competition, so to say. But my interest was really always in Cambodia. In Cambodia's political trajectory and in the kind of relationships, transnational relationships that have emerged in the context of peacebuilding interventions. So as such, my perspective on the role of the Paris Peace Agreements really in shaping Cambodia's political trajectory has also developed quite differently. So it's not through direct involvement in planning or implementation of peacebuilding projects, but through a literature, through interviews over 12 years now, and perhaps most significantly to me personally, through archival research. So you might be aware of the fact that the UN mission to Cambodia left a very long paper trail. Many collections were actually preserved through private initiatives of people who worked for the mission, for the radio station, etc., journalists, members of the mission. And I know that archival research might sound slightly boring, perhaps a little bit detached from the ground, but to me, personally, I've always experienced it as really fascinating. Tracing and reading these documents over such a long period of time really brought to life various different aspects of this mission. So I just want to give you a few examples. I was in different life here. Yeah. Chicago and New York houses very important collections, and these kind of collections were really important for me to get a sense for the way in which policy documents, reports, field notes moved through the different units. Many of them obviously dealt with the challenges that people on the ground had in implementing the mission, but also in adjudicating between the different interests of the four very charismatic and perhaps slightly difficult leaders of the four factions, right? The Memorial Library in Wisconsin-Madison, as some of you may know, houses the entire archive of the Radio UNTAC, of Radio UNTAC. So the radio station really broadcasted over 18 months, and I've returned to that archive many times just to listen and read the program scripts about the way in which the peacebuilding mission was really communicated to the Cambodian people. Daily reports, there was advice to the new voters, there was roundtables where the leaders of the then 20 parties, so it was really 20 parties who had registered, discussed their plans for Cambodia should they become, voted into power. I think the most unusual collection of all, and that really brought to life an aspect that I hadn't read about before, is in Paris. And it's consisting of hundreds, almost 1,000 letters that the Cambodian people wrote at the time to Radio UNTAC to describe how the peace process affected them. They also used it to reach out to fellow Cambodians. So they had self-composed poems and songs to talk about life under the intervention and express basically their hopes for the future. So to me, what was always really quite striking was the extent to which the Paris peace agreements shaped these documents, right? The writing of these documents. I mean, the agreements obviously defined a plan as it related to the mandate, but it also had a quite fundamental impact on the nature of this national and transnational debate as it evolved over the future of Cambodia, its status and future. So the Paris peace agreements actually shaped the language, but also the ideas in all these documents in different and really quite distinct ways. So if I look at the policy documents and the reports, there was always a reference to these agreements as, you know, in defining rights and obligation and responsibilities. And they were always very clear cut in these terms, but then not in practice. So it became much more fluid and messy in that regard. And for Radio UNTAC, the Paris Peace Agreements really provided a template to craft what my interview partners later referred to as an international voice, a coherent international voice. So sticking to the template of the Paris Peace Agreements was not only important to avoid diplomatic blunders. So you could always find these kind of edits on the side of the documents to say, please do not refer to the existing administrative structures as a government, which seemed to have happened more than once. But they also used it to basically try and model a new political language, something that was less confrontational. Unbiased was a term they often used, democratic political discourse. And in the letters that the Cambodian people sent to Radio UNTAC, they often expressed gratefulness because the agreements, they had this promise of a different future, but there was also a lot of uncertainty. So we can already see that there was this nationwide discussion that evolved around what this vision of the agreement would really mean for people who were still facing very, very difficult circumstances, economically, in all kinds of regards. So one of the authors actually said, so what will life after the Paris peace agreements look like? So to me personally, the 30th anniversary of the Paris peace agreement really was an opportunity to pick up on all of these questions. At the time, so like almost a year ago now, I cooperated with a policy think tank in Cambodia and invited young Cambodians to work with these documents. So I gave them access to these archives that I had collected over the last 10 years and asked what they think, what the legacy of the agreements is, because, well, if I looked at these letters, 1992, 1993, when people talked about the future, they obviously thought of them, right? I know that most of you are regional experts, so none of you will be very surprised to hear that the assessments that they had were mixed, but also formulated in very careful terms. In fact, one of the authors said, we have to just acknowledge that alongside January 7th, the 23rd of October will always be the most contested memory in Cambodian history. So on the positive side, the young authors really recognize, obviously, that Cambodia derived a lot of economic benefits from its new status as this politically stable country. In contrast to Prime Minister's assertion, they were also quite insistent in saying that, yes, it was agreements that established peace, despite the ongoing fighting afterwards. They said it ended what Cambodians at the time always referred to as a time that was marked by mountains of bones, rivers of blood, and an ocean of suffering. However, there was also very carefully formulated criticism. So one strand of it referred to the lost or unfulfilled vision of the agreements, which is obviously a very vague term, but refers to the democratic potential, democratic freedoms. It's a critique that echoes the voices of the diaspora in Cambodia, I guess, the opposition, who have very often returned to these agreements to say there is a responsibility here. And the second strand referred to more precisely what actually should be this legacy, right? One of them said, actually, we should look at what we have achieved. There was a clear desire to move on. They said, well, we were once a country that required peacekeepers, and now we're actually contributing to peacekeeping, and this is how we should best celebrate this legacy. So in light of these very different positions and agendas, I always thought it's quite difficult to say what exactly this legacy could be and should be. Also in light of what we've already referred to as the different roles and agendas of China, a different model altogether of peace building that is now captured in terms of pragmatic or perpetual. So I would just want to say this, I always thought it's quite remarkable that the Paris peace agreements continue to be this point of reference that people return to. So today, as was the case during all these months long in the mission, it wasn't just a mandate, but not something to settle a conflict or allocate responsibilities, but it was always a point to begin and structure conversations. So today, it's still a point of reference to acknowledge that there is existing relations of trust and to express, I think, a continued willingness and desire to search for mutual advice, for support and partnerships to develop visions of who Cambodia is or who Cambodia wants to be 30 years on. Thank you.
Thank you all three for really interesting and quite complementary perspectives. We will have a couple of minutes to discuss and then throw it to the audience. And then John McCarthy is going to be providing some concluding remarks. I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge that we actually have among us today a group of Cambodian friends who've come all the way from Sydney to participate in the experience. A former Cambodian member of Parliament. Yeah. So I just wanted to acknowledge that you have here, and I hope that we get to hear a question or maybe an observation from you during the course of our discussions. I'd like to start off by, I guess, referring, John, to your reference to the second agreement. And I guess also Kathleen and Michael also talked about the different perspectives and what people, the concept of legitimacy and how people chose to interpret the process that was launched in the elections. And whether what we find in Cambodia now, apart from the fact that I think when said there was a second agreement, corresponds more now to the way we manage to the kind of drift away from the liberal democratic order, if you like, to something that is a little bit more authoritarian and nation-state and doesn't lend itself to the kinds of negotiations that you were involved with, Mike, in the lead up to his report. So, has the external situation changed sufficiently that we can use the same tools, or do we have to view things in a little bit more of a pragmatic way? I guess is what I'm asking. Maybe, Mike, do you want to go off on that?
I think the question on this that's often framed to me is, well, where's the democracy in this country? Didn't you fail? You've got one cent. To which my answers are, we don't have the Khmer Rouge, who were going to win. My authority for that is one cent. You've got to remember the Russians were pulling out Vietnam, and the Vietnam was pulling out of Cambodia. And China was continuing to support the KR. So that's one answer, but it's not a complete answer. In his speech at the Paris Peace Conference, where everyone signed up, Gareth emphasised democracy is a very difficult thing to do. You're not guaranteed a success, and you're not guaranteed of its perpetual nature. You have to fight for liberty and democracy every day and be very, very protective. Sometimes it does work. South Korea was a dictatorship for a while. It's a democracy now, and a vigorous one. Indonesia, always, you feel a bit worried about it at times, but it's a very large, very successful democracy. And for those of us, some countries who'd like to lecture on democracy, they need to have a good look at themselves. I don't mean to be unkind, but what country most stands out at the moment in saying every election that doesn't elect them, their party, is rigged? What particular party in a particular country has the state governments which control national elections changing the law so that if the vote for there doesn't go the right way, their Republican controlled House can overrule the popular vote. These are not, God, they elected a right-wing government, say Sweden or Italy or Hungary or whatever. This is actually at the heart of the democratic process. And it's catching fire. It's Bolsonaro saying down in Brazil, it's rigged. So the threat to democracy is not only in developing countries, in Cambodia, it's there all the time in every country. In our own Voices Off case, our previous Prime Minister had 5 portfolios that nobody knew about. He also had a committee, a cabinet, which was a committee of one person, serviced by the head of the intelligence agency, Shearer, but nobody knew about it. So you've always got to be careful and protective of democracy. That's what Gareth was saying. And the advice to Cambodia was, this is going to be a struggle. And you're going to be fighting it all the time. And it appears that all of us ought to be conscious of it all the time. And my dearest wish is that Hun Sen hadn't behaved the way he did. But there are plenty worse than him around. That's not much consolation.
So John, he's the guy that we deal with. You mentioned him recently, and so one has to find a modus vivendi. No.
Look, I agree with what Mike said. You know, it's very precarious, you know, for a liberal democracy. And basically, I mean, liberal democracy grew out of a decision that, you know, we needed to have government where we didn't have to kill the king in order to change the government. You know, so it slowly emerged out of that. The Americans decided they would elect the king every 4 years, and they can only have 2 lots of 4 years. But they're very difficult to get rid of, and they use their 4 years to build a lot of power around them politically. So, and this is the way it is in many countries. And Hun Sen, you know, you take his. First of all, Cambodia is in a very precarious position. I mean, when the French came up the river in 1864 as a protector, it was in the process of disappearing off the map, squeezed between Vietnam and Thailand. And the tides can only expand eastwards. They're terrified of the Burmese. So that's their sort of expansion space. And the Viets, you know, because large part of southern Vietnam is Khmer, it's old coach in China, which the French handed over to the Vietnamese and used the Vietnamese to administer that and a large part of Cambodia during their time as the European controller in that particular part of the world. So Cambodia sits in a very precarious position. It needs a protector. It needs a protector. And it needs to take a very strong position. My conclusion after my most recent visit there is that at the moment, they're moving forward on the Belt and Road, admittedly, but they put themselves really in the hands of China. And they're still getting a lot of investment from Japan. I mean, basically, the Japanese went along with the Hun Sen regime because Southeast Asia was a sort of market forces competition place between China and Japan after the so that goes on. I mean, there's huge amounts of Japanese money have been invested in the country as well as Chinese, and you know, slowly but surely, young Cambodians have a future within that country. So I take some heart from that. Stability is more important than liberal democracy in Southeast Asia.
And that leads nicely into what you've been talking about, Katrin. Before I ask you to make a comment, can I remind our audience, our virtual audience, that you can post your questions to the address, the link that you've been given, and we can raise those questions then in the broader conversation. So don't forget to lodge your questions if you can't be in the room yourselves.
Yes, there is 2 points actually that I would like to pick up on. So one obviously relates to Sihanouk's role, something that I found quite fascinating to trace in the documents, where he went from this symbol of national reconciliation to, I would want to say, like a quite challenging partner. So he started to refer to it. It became clear that the presidential elections wouldn't happen, as the UNTACist elections, and UN officials at the time started to exchange messages and said, he's actually going to undermine the credibility of the election if this continues. What he started to refer, for instance, also to Rana Rit and Hun Sen as his 2 sons. So what we can actually see here is a motive that's quite enduring in Cambodian politics, namely this co-optation of national unity for the purpose of preserving the power of one party. So Sihanouk used the model of the Sangpokpung Reunion at the time as a model to present this. And Hun Sen has done something that is quite similar actually after the 2018 election. He invited all of the other opposition parties to this new national council, and that drew on the same historical motives, really. So it's something that we can see over time. And the other element, something that I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Michael, it reminded me of something I've discussed with friends in Cambodia who are members of civil society, broadly speaking. And they always said, well, we had this discussion about the end of history and what Cambodia means for that. And we have to really remember that this teleological pull, it was convincing because the end of history, it wasn't just an abstract term, it was embodied by the United States. And they quite assertively worked with this. So after what happened now, one of my friends told me that for a very long time, maybe it was a tradition that the United States would invite people from a country like Cambodia to observe the elections and to see how the peaceful transfer of power works in a mature democracy. So I wonder if this is still the case, but it isn't. But I think the damage is quite severe, regardless of where you're standing on former or current president. It's something.
That's right. It goes beyond partisan politics. It really, what they're doing, changing the method of election so that they can't lose, sounds rather familiar.
Yes.
Yeah.
We've got to a time where we would like to hear from our audience. So Bryce, I don't know whether you've got any questions.
Not yet,
from
but
the
please-
audience. So,
Please do lots of it.
so I would like to invite our audience now to ask
Yes,
questions.
Sawate from Cambodia in Sydney, and thank you for the opportunity. It's really great that the Institute has brought people with life experience and also passion on Cambodian issue. This is actually a very good timing because the 23rd of October is coming. So the Cambodian community that I led is proposing to have an event in the federal parliament sometime on the 28th of November. And Professor Gareth Evans has been requested to officiate in that event. We will invite if anyone would like to attend. My question is very simple because I actually listened to Mr. Costello and he identified something which is very good. That is, people are troubled by history. And I also heard this, that the 7th of January and the 23rd of October are to be running concurrently for the Cambodia as part of their legacy. My question to the panel, and I guess it's actually for research and academic as well. In Cambodia now, if you go to Cambodia across the entire landscape, an important landmark, there's always the symbol of 7th of January. There is no single structure that Hun Sen has devoted to the Paris Peace Accord. So we are talking about people are being troubled by history. And so I'm just wondering, does that really trouble, given that we as Australian and also the United Nations have invested so much money in Cambodia? And I also heard Mr. Costello said this. There are a lot of worse people than Hun Sen. And my question is, perhaps we can share which country or which leaders that Australia invests so much, with so much document, with so much inspirations, with so much hope, and it turned out to be the way we are now. Perhaps you could share with one leader in the entire world.
Well, we've never had a role like this with any other country, so I can't answer your question. There are plenty of other leaders who are nasty. Not much consolation. Look, it's an enormous disappointment that he should have done what he's done. As I said, it's not unique. What seems to me to not be working all that well is outside countries imposing a political system on another country. Look how many times we've tried in the last 20 or 30 years to bring democracy by force in cases to other countries. Sometimes incidental. Afghanistan, full of good intentions. Iraq, you could argue the intentions on that, but basically people with good intentions. In the end, with support from outside, countries have to find their own way through. Some do and some don't. I'm not trying to be dismissive of this. It's just reality of life. South Korea had one dictator after another. Now, what it is. Indonesia ended up with Suharto, a relatively benign dictator if you're going to have one, but he was. They've got a thriving democracy now. I by no means have given up that in the longer run, that will be the case in Cambodia. But you're situated next to China, which is going, I must say, I was talking to Ambassador, who I shouldn't identify, but someone who's approximate to China. He said, you've just got to face the fact. You just got to face the fact. We live with this giant, with this massive power, and we can't go too far from what they want. Depressing. So that doesn't mean you can't have a democracy and you can't have a liberal democracy. And you should. And if you think that anything I said mandates that it's all okay and don't you worry about that, I don't think like that. I don't. I think it's a tragedy, but it's better than the community.
Can I just add something? Now, look, I've had discussions with Hun Sen before and after the election and over many years. And every time I used to speak, he used to tell me that the United Nations was the worst thing that ever happened to Cambodia. That's because we saw through an election when we actually knew that it was going to lose. You know, and it was a bit of a shock to a lot of countries who'd already accepted that he was going to win and started to deal with him on that basis. So the fact of the matter is, he keeps saying that UN was the worst thing that happened to Cambodia, primarily because we didn't go along with the other agreement that he was party to. My two sons and the Khmer Rouge obviously thought that that was a betrayal, and they kept at us about letting the SOC take control of the whole process, because they were sure that we were going to let them win. You know, they convinced themselves of that. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, in addition to saying the UN was the worst thing that happened to Cambodia, he does say that I have this win-win strategy in which I embrace everybody in the whole process. And sure, you know, there's any political leaders who have been critical of his regime have been banned from the country. They've been kicked out. That included Norodom Branovic for quite early in the piece. He was removed from the country. A lot of others have been. But he has embraced also a lot of other people. There are people from a lot of other parties who are not in real positions of power, but are in significant positions there. But the interesting thing to me, going back this time, is the young people. The young people are standing up straight about the future. And I mean, I even ran into a whole bunch of children of former Khmer Rouge who had tertiary education and, you know, were part of it, saw themselves as part of the future of Cambodia. So that's going on. It's another perspective on this win-win strategy, and a long period of stability in Cambodia, a longer period of stability than they've had for a very long time. So I'm a Liberal Democrat. And I'm signed up for all the principles and protocols and conventions of the United Nations. In fact, I think I'm signed up to the protocols and conventions of the United Nations more than most members of the United Nations.
Could I say, I was very interested in your observation. There's no memorial or signifier about the UN and its role in the country in the 23rd of October. I think that's disrespectful. I think there ought to be some argument about that, put to the Cambodian government.
Could I just make this observation? I think we have been influenced by Hun Sen's values. Now we're talking about the win-win, and we quote that win-win situation. Now in Sydney, in Australia, they have this kind of thing that they influence the entire community. They call like this happy family. Now I go back to your observation that the young people are all happy, are all standing up. It's the same thing as in Sydney. Suddenly he sent all his network to his son, promoting all of us to be in a happy family. What does this happy family do to Hun Sen? You are to be happy with all of us, and you are not to take the opposition. If you take up the opposition, you are being as if you are promoting the Paris Peace Accord. In Sydney, in Australia now, we are at a war with Hun Sen's network. I'm talking about this very seriously because it's been in the Australian reasoning, the Australian written by Stephen Weiss. And we refer that to the parliament already. We are talking about a new kind of values that Hun Sen is promoting in Australia. It's called happy family. In Cambodia, they call it a win-win situation. So I think we ought to be very cautious in terms of quoting his kind of policy, because this is policy that we have now learned that the Paris Peace Accord really has a little bit of problem for all of us. And I think for those people who do not want to be in the happy family, it can be seen like we are a deeper discipline of his value in this relation. But that's
Not for me. It's not for me or anyone in any Australian to tell you what attitude to take with your business.
yeah.
But you do know the primary threat to Hun Sen comes from within his own party, not from elsewhere. You know, that's the thing I think that drives him. All through the provinces in Cambodia, the photographs up on in every town and every village, Hun Sen and Heng Samrin.
Yes.
Okay, who will die soon? Hmm?
Here's
It'll be
like-
interesting to see whose photograph goes up then. Hmm?
We have
There was
time.
3 photos, now there are only 2.
We have
Right?
for, one more question.
I come from a different angle altogether. And I want to know, how are the Cambodian people going? Is their quality of life improving? Is their nutritional uptake improving? What are the grounds for their happiness? Because when I see them there, they seem happy.
Well, look, all I can say is this. Compared to what they were facing before these agreements, which did bring peace to the country, they're a lot happier than they were then. Are they as happy as they could be? Maybe some are, some aren't. But what they don't have is what we would regard and would look for is a degree of freedom of political choice and opportunity. That's what they don't have. And that to me is a huge thing. But on the other things you're talking about, it's inconceivable they wouldn't be better off than they were under the Khmer Rouge. That was a total nightmare. So that's not a high hurdle to jump. Let's put it that way. But on the right to be in opposition or to have a different point of view or an alternative government, no. Well, they're not no worse off than they were under Khmer Rouge, but that again is not a high hurdle to jump.
There's a growing middle class in Cambodia. Yeah, it's a growing middle class, and it's growing, and 67% of the population is under the age of 30, which is staggering.
What is really striking to me and somewhat depressing, it has nothing to do with nutritional value, but with potential. And if you look at the party symbols, how they have evolved from UNTAC, there was 20 parties until now. If you would just do it in a time frame, you would see all of them disappear and some of them slowly reappear, change. And it's all kind of symbolic for the pressure that people who have tried to make a constructive contribution to the future of their country have been under. So they have been constantly harassed. They have been under constant intimidation, and has really increased over the last 7 years. So just to see, like right now, when there is some people who have been voted in a modest amount of power, these kind of campaigns start immediately. So what does this mean for all these people who could have contributed something much more constructively just to deal with this constant pressure? This is something that I always feel quite strongly about when talking to people. Yes, so that is.
Tony wanted to ask one final quick question.
Question, after you respond to this too, but getting to that issue of whether we can have initiative. Now, what can Australia do in the region now? I just wondered if you could compare a little bit our influence, prestige in Southeast Asia now with how it was 30 years ago. Are we in a stronger position now or a weaker one in order to do new and significant things in the region?
Well, I have to be careful of, in my day. The reason I have not written a memoir. If only they'd listen to me. So I think it's not unfair to say that during the 90s, 2000s, for most of that time, not all of it, our interest in the region, foreign policy and diplomacy declined. Our interest. I don't think there was objections raised in the region. I just think that the focus turned to security issues and defence issues, and the region really, well, you know, that's the second order, third order stuff. But of course it is first order. And I think in an incredibly impressive way, this is not party political, it's just an observation of professionalism, the department and the minister have seized that pattern and are running hard with it. Now, that's not something you just flick a light, turn the switch on, grab the baton and all's well. That's going to require another 5 or 10 years to get back where we should be, to get where we should be. Diplomacy is building those long-term relationships so that when you need them, they're there. Not that, oh, well, here's a transaction we can do for you if you'll only, you know, like some of the Solomon Island stuff that they were up to. You know, the countries need to know a number of things. That you've taken the trouble to listen to them and you've actually heard what they've had to say. That you put yourself in their shoes and thought about things from their perspective. It doesn't mean you have to agree with their perspective, but you at least have to understand it. And that you're diligent in your diplomatic activity, not just in the grand gestures and conferences and shuttle diplomacy, but in the ordinary day-to-day business, so that they regard you as a reliable and trusted friend for when you need them, which you will one day. So I think the answer to your question is I think we declined because of a lack of interest on our part. And it's been resuscitated at the moment. That's how I see it anyway. But I'm very careful of saying, in my day, it was very different.
Tony, I think the circumstances have changed considerably since we were involved in things like the Colombo Plan and Cambodia, for example. As a dramatically large player who's asserting their rights within the region. And the fact of the matter is, you actually have to establish a trusted and respected relationship with that player.
We certainly do.
And that's going to be
without losing our self-respect.
That's right.
No, we're being
Sorry, I
a bit
interrupted.
loose with the time, but I don't think anyone's rushing out the door, and this discussion's really getting interesting. So we'll have a couple more, one from the Zoom audience and one from here, and then we'll conclude with John's remarks.
Great.
Okay, fantastic. So we've got one here from John Blackflint, who's a well-known friend of the AIIA. He's professor at ANU, of course. He's asking about the current situation. What can the Paris Peace Accord say for us today as we think about the situation in Myanmar? Is there a role Australia can play in facilitating a more coordinated and constructive regional response?
John. We've actually attempted to play a role in Myanmar in the past, but things weren't as quite as dramatic as they are now. And Hun Sen, of course, as chair of ASEAN, has also gone over and given them a quiet lecture on the win-win strategy, which they told him to mind his own business. And, so that wasn't much of a success. This is, I mean, I think we have to realise that Cambodia was a long way down the track, or South Indochina was a long way down the track before our successful intervention. And Myanmar has got a long way to go.
And it's a very uncertain situation there. You've got the involvement of China and Russia, both involved. Neither of them is prepared to say, oh, well, we'll let a country like Australia come in and sort this one out. Don't have that sort of relationship with them at the moment. So I'm not sure, and I'm not sure ASEAN would welcome us poking our nose in at the moment either. I think that's the way they would see it. They've taken it upon themselves to deal with this issue, and I think anything we did would not be particularly productive. That's just what I think. But you know something? You never know until you try. You never know until you try. It might be worth at least trying to think hard about it, trying to see what we could do, even in the most modest way. I don't think there's any grand. That's just my view. I think, what do you think?
Well, actually, speaking to John, our colleague, Deepak, Nia, he wrote a very interesting piece reflecting precisely on the legacy of the Paris Peace Agreements as it relates to ASEAN and Myanmar. And he made two observations. One, that we really have to keep our expectations low because ASEAN is a very conservative organization. So the chances of them intervening on behalf of the democracy movement shouldn't be overplayed. And looking at the agreements, he said, well, the agreements probably aren't the model to go for, but we look at the time leading up to the agreements, the role that, for instance, a country like Indonesia played, perhaps, just to boil it down, not to have like the bloc as such engage with these people, but to have individual relationships, also to bypass certain diplomatic standards that would potentially offer some model. Very careful. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to have to be a little bit more disciplinary at that time. John, I think it's time for you to make your concluding remarks, and then we can still have an exchange afterwards over drinks and answer questions. Thanks, John.
Well, it's always a pleasure to listen to three very distinguished Australians and one very distinguished German. So I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Look, I just want to really make a few reflections on where I think this is all left us in Australia. And I say this without trying to cover the ground. I mean, there are enormous subjects involved here. Let me just make a very brief initial comment. And that was when we came out of the First or the Second World War, we really were faced with three big issues. One was the alliance with the United States and how that was necessary to us as we saw it then, and I think it's still right. The second was how to deal with and play a role in the international machinery that was being created after the Second World War. And the third was dealing with emerging Southeast Asia, dealing with the wars of decolonization, the political movements of decolonization, making friends with countries with whom we've had not negligible dealings, but certainly not considerable dealings. All those things came together. Now, where at least two of them fitted very, very closely together. In the years from 1945, really, if not 1945, the late 40s, through really right until the early 90s, when Cambodia in the end was, I know certain of our friends won't say resolved, but at least the struggle was ended as we understood it. Throughout that period, the two real issues for Australian engagement were America and dealing with America, and doing essentially what America largely wanted and what we wanted of America. And the second thing, which was closely intermingled with this, was how we deal with Southeast Asia. And that was the Malayan emergency, first of all. It was a whole host of problems within Indonesia. And of course, it was the Indochina Wars, starting in 1954, where we had a minimal role, really. The American War, where we had a very substantial role. And against the background of this, of course, Korea was also going on in the early 50s. So the bundle of problems we were dealing with, really all had to do, one way or another, with Indochina, including the issue of international machinery, that third bundle. Now, whatever you might say about what happened in Cambodia and the degree to which many felt very let down by Hun Sen and by the solution which brought about Hun Sen, the fact was the Paris agreements ended the Indochina Wars. They ended they changed three very considerable chapters in our diplomatic post-war history, and they, in fact, ended one such diplomatic chapter. Now, that is hugely significant. And so when I hear people downplaying the whole Cambodian exercise, I say, yeah, there were mistakes. God, there were mistakes. I was living next door in Bangkok. I was in Hanoi when Bill Hayden came up with Mike Costello in 1983. The errors were everywhere to see. But somewhere along that line, from 83 right through to 91, things were changing for the better. And for Australia, that was hugely significant. There were, as I say, I repeat again, there were people who suffered. The solutions were not what we necessarily wanted. Some of the solutions weren't what we wanted at all. But the big solution actually was achieved. You've got a new ASEAN, not particularly a strong ASEAN, not a particularly effective ASEAN, but an ASEAN that has somehow maintained a sort of peace in their area for the better part of a generation. And that too is not insignificant. The second thing I want to say, and this is very seldom alluded to, is the experience we had diplomatically during the whole Cambodia exercise and before that, and I mean in the 80s as well, plus the military experience which we had under John Sanderson, had a very significant effect on the manner in which we were able somehow to get through the Timor crisis. People don't realize in Australia today, thanks to the political rhetoric of the time, just how narrow a business that was. To quote the Duke of Wellington, I forget what he exactly said, but it was something like, it was the narrowest damn thing I ever saw. It was the narrow. I mean, we were really very, very fortunate in getting through that process. We would not have done it without the development of the multilateral and bilateral diplomatic skill, which was achieved during that whole Vietnam process, particularly towards the end, and because of the importance and significance and leadership of the Australian military during that Cambodian issue. So that whole business of Timor, and again, I was in Jakarta then, I talked personally, we were very, very lucky. And the degree that we got through it was because of the experience of our system. That's the second point I want to make. The third is, could we do it today? Well, the others have explained that the situation globally which we face today is entirely different to the end of the Cold War. We have a strong and very, very able opponent, not an opponent which is on its last legs and which is economically failing. That, I mean, has to be understood. Secondly, towards when we sorted out Cambodia, people already wanted to stop Vietnam. It was just how to do it. Nobody really wanted to continue. The Americans were exhausted. The Chinese had spent a great deal of money. The Russians are falling apart. The Southeast Asians certainly didn't want any more of it. And the Vietnamese were economically exhausted, absolutely economically exhausted, an entirely different situation. So the politics is different. So can Australia achieve something like this again? I don't see it in the next few years. I just don't see how it can happen because of global political circumstances. The second point is our capacity as a government and as a nation to deal with these sorts of problems again. I go along with Mike. I think we were at our high point as diplomats and as diplomatic soldiers, actually, during that period. We'd had all the experience. We'd had a lot of experience in Vietnam. We knew how to fight. We knew how to do these things. We knew how to run military operations. And at the same time, you had a very, very effective minister who would not lay off anybody until the job got done. And so the diplomatic work might have been exhausting for those involved. I can tell you it was, and Michael can tell you that more than anybody else. But it actually worked. Now, we've gone downhill since then. I mean, Michael's been polite. But the drop since that period in our diplomatic capacity, I'm not in a position to judge our military diplomatic capacity, but our diplomatic capacity has declined. And it's mainly because the ministers haven't been of the capacity of Evans and I think Hayden. And I think that, you know, they haven't been incompetent, they're not nitwits. But you have to have somebody, for a country like Australia of 25 million, they have to be enormously well led. And we had that with Evans and certainly Hawke and Hayden. But Evans was basically the guy who did the really hard, heavy lifting on the issue. And I think he has to be given credit for that. Now, whether the Foreign Service, and I mean by the Foreign Service, not just DFAT, it is now a whole international apparatus, some of which is good and some of which is not good. It's defense, it's DFAT, it's this creation Home Affairs, it's a whole group of organizations which have a major international responsibility. The work's still being done on that. I think what we have now is very promising. We've got promising departmental leadership, I think growing up at least in the public service, and we've got good ministers. But it is quite another thing to sort out Cambodia again. But we do have the diplomatic capacity now, we're beginning to develop the diplomatic capacity now that we had 15 or 20 years ago, or longer, 30 years ago even. But it's just beginning, and let's not hold our breath. It's going to require real pressure from the political class. It's going to require dedication, and it is going to require the respect of the Australian people. And they will only give that respect if they see some sort of service in return. Nothing.
Thank you very much, John. That was a terrific sum up, and certainly covered a number of the points that we heard today. I just want to conclude by once again asking you to join me in thanking our wonderful panel for the thoughtful remarks and the spending time with us today and providing such interesting and varied insights. So please join me. Thank you, Bryce, for your hospitality. I also wanted to mention, I don't even know whether he's zooming in or not, but Don Greenlees, who's been working with us as our, who's been managing a lot, curating all the articles on our website, Insights, who's also an advisor in our diplomacy team, is responsible for putting together this publication and seeing it to its publication stage. So thank you very much to Don Greenlees, positive by the Asialink for putting together this report, which I hope you will all take a copy home today. And finally, a word about Asialink. So Asialink was created 30 years ago to build Australia's Asian capability and connections. It seems to me that in light of what we've heard today, and also understanding what Australia's challenges are in its region, organisations like ours that really develop connections and capability are more important than ever. And we're certainly excited by the opportunity that the government is showing us in terms of its interest in partnering with us, in working with them and helping them really forge a place for ourselves in the region, precisely to do what Mike pointed out we must not be doing, to go from the transactional to the relationship, to the long-term relationships, because this is our region, it's a shared region, and we need to be there permanently and in great numbers and great skill. And that's a mission for all of us. Thank you for coming to